Welcome boys and girls, Christine here with a discussion about the Skaven within the context of the Lords of the End Times. Because while Creative Assembly has focused on Nagash, Vampire Counts, Tomb Kings, Coast even, in their trailer for Nagash DLC, it is very likely that they are going to do something with the Skaven. The general consensus is that they are likely going to be doing Tankwall as a legendary lord for the Skaven in Lords of the End Times. And it would make a lot of sense given the importance of the Skaven in the End Times. Because you see, the Skaven did a huge number of things in the End Times. First and foremost, they actually unified under Tankwall. I know it sounds hilarious, but my understanding of the subject is that they basically created a radio, or rather a telegram or telephone. Unsure, it's Skaven ultimately. But they were able to coordinate a huge number of things. One of the important things early on is that they launched a massive invasion of Lustria. And while they didn't succeed in conquering it, they did manage to cause the Lizardmen to devote significant resources trying to stop them. And while the Lizardmen did manage that, the Skaven retaliated by blowing up the moon. So that is one of the things we should expect with regards to Lords of End Times, that entire conflict in Lustria. I mean, to be fair, many people, including myself, don't care much for Lustria, but the reality is that is an important point in the End Times. Something else that they actually did, they invaded Cathay alongside the Cast Dwarves, Chaos in general, until they were beaten up by Grimgor. Yes, Grimgor managed to kind of save Cathay. Well, it's a bit more complicated. Rather, he just showed up, beat the crap out of everyone, and then Cathay was like, we're out. That is something else that happened then. And the grand finale, if you will, is that the Skaven took over Tylea, Estalia, Border Princes, a huge swath of territory in the south over here, or the south of the Old World. They also marched on Carcadrin, Karzakarak, they took out Belegar. So basically the Skaven were getting shit done, far more so than Archeon. Like, you want to know who the principal characters of the End Times are? Well, one of them is, of course, Nagash. The other one is Tankwall. Now, it will be interesting to see how Tankwall's campaign will play out, because he really should be in control of Skavenblight as opposed to Ikeclaw. Though, to be quite blunt about it, Ikeclaw himself did play a major role in the End Times, as did all of the Skaven clans, all of the Skaven legendary lords, except, well, Tretch, who's not really a legendary lord. But still, when you look at Queek, when you look at Ikeclaw, when you look at others, they did have some major roles in the End Times. For Ikeclaw, it was blowing up the Black Pyramid of Nagash, because, spoiler alert, Nagash almost won the End Times, until the Skaven and Nurgle just basically blew up his pyramid. It was a fairly major battle in Sylvania at the time, due to that. Now, that's their role from a story perspective, but what about the gameplay standpoint? Well, of course, one of the things that would make that work would be a confederation system for the Skaven across the entire map, or some kind of coordination system that Tankwall in particular should have in that campaign, provided, of course, they're going to be doing Tankwall. That is one thing that I believe Creative Assembly should focus on. Then you have the usual stuff, things like updating the research tree, updating recruitment priorities, buildings, economics, etc. Like, especially with the economic situation of the Skaven, I think that is something that does work but could use an update. The reason it could use an update is that Skaven rely on provinces with multiple settlements in order to have a huge amount of economic potential, largely because of the arcane generators and the fact that they don't really have an economic building, and instead rely on the fact that every single one of their buildings generates some level of income. That is how Skaven generate money in their campaign, but that does mean that they are more vulnerable than many other factions in the game, to having provinces made up of single regions or 2 regions. It especially hurts Ikic a lot because Skaven Blight, Tier 1 settlement, limited growth as a result of the situation that he has to deal with. It isn't ideal. So some territorial changes, especially with regards to Skaven Blight and Help It, would be in order, making these part of bigger provinces. So Skaven Blight would be the provincial capital, Help It would be the provincial capital, but you would have extra regions. Or a change in how the entire growth system and population surplus system works. Because right now the game is very much heavily focused on the idea that factions that control 4 region provinces have an inherent advantage compared to others. We could also talk about the food metric. So food obviously does work, but the way you increase food capacity, either through research or controlling more settlements, and the way food is spent, as well as the metrics over here, I think like having a percentage of food as opposed to a flat value of food that might go up as you play for a campaign would be better, because right now it is pretty easy later on in a campaign either to be dominant in terms of the amount of food you have or to be in a complete deficit, depending on the situation. It's also a question of how much food you're gaining per turn, because battles may not provide you with the amount of food you need. So there are certainly some balancing aspects with regards to how the Skaven could work in terms of food, in terms of settlements, in terms of research. Furthermore, we should talk about the recruitment situation for Skaven. Skaven have a really good army roster. They have ranged units, artillery units, mechanical units, monstrous units. They don't have flying units, but they do make up for it with all the ranged units, all the things like warp fire throwers, warp grinders, rattling gunners, etc. That's good. The one major problem Skaven do have in terms of their existing roster, beyond the flexibility that flying units could provide, as well as obviously not having cavalry. Monsters, no, are not cavalry, and there are races that have both cavalry and monsters. But the big problem Skaven have with regards to their infantry roster, is with regards to infantry. So Clan Rats and Skaven Slaves are damn near useless in a combat situation. Yes, there are some useful units in melee, but you do lack a good, solid line holder. And one could argue that Skaven shouldn't be about that. Well, never mind that Storm Vermin are pretty good units in theory, but in practice they're not that great because of the recruitment duration of Storm Vermin. So that recruitment duration should be reduced from 2 turns to 1 turn. The tier is fine, but the cost is maybe a bit too high considering their combat capability. Another problem I would say with regards to Skaven is that they're supposed to be a swarm faction. They're supposed to be a faction that masses a significant number of units and dominates their opponents with a combination of high-end weaponry and raw numbers. That's how Skaven work in the lore. The reason this doesn't work in the game is because you do have supply lines, so you can't just maintain infinite number of armies. So maybe that's something Grave Assembly might want to consider with the Skaven. If there is a faction that should not work on regular supply lines, it would be the Skaven. Or what they could do is go down a different path. You see, we already have armies, and the recent Norska rework also gave Trog, faction-wide, once you get to a certain level, the ability of attaching armies to every single Lord army in the campaign. So instead of having the current situation where you can only have Skaven slaves in a regular army, having a secondary army that you could recruit in. Yes, recruit in Skaven slaves and clan rats and only those particular units, while your main army is made up of higher end units, would be a great system. Maybe something you unlock throughout the campaign, like early on, maybe you can't do it, but let's say after turn 5 and 10, you get a couple of limited slots of extra units, kind of like a WA attached to a main army, and then as you progress through the campaign, or as maybe you get more food, There's different systems that could be used for this, but essentially it would really be about making sure that the entire swarm aspect of the faction is in play in a campaign. In a way, it isn't when you're playing the Skaven at the moment. Now, in terms of units that Skaven would be getting with regards to the Lords of the End Times, we would be looking at the greater demons of the Skaven. Not sure about lord choices, hero choices, but yeah, greater demons and demons of the Horned Rat is what's really missing with the Skaven. I think the vast majority of the unit roster they have from the tabletop is already present, though don't quote me on that, I could be wrong on it. Certainly some unit adjustments, tier recruitments and all that, like Doom Wheels being tier 5 is a bit ridiculous. Plague Monk Census Bearers being tier 5, again, a bit ridiculous. So there are absolutely certain things that they can add here, but the problems, if you want to call them that, with the Skaven are not really related to units except infantry, and certainly not a lack of unit variety. It's more about the recruitment of certain units, their combat effectiveness versus their cost, as well as not being able to make the swarm faction really play out. I mean, certainly we at least have expendable for Skaven slaves. That at least is present there, but I think they could go even further with regards to this system. But that's where I stand on this subject. Let me know what you guys think on all of this, and we'll see what Creative Assembly has to deliver. Stay tuned.